I am Natalie, 27 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I was just a kindergarten teacher, living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment filled with second-hand furniture and houseplants. My life was simple, even ordinary, but I had been raised by two extraordinary people, my grandparents, Elizabeth and Harold, who shaped me more than my own parents ever did. They were wealthy, but they lived humbly, teaching me that character mattered more than cash. From the time I was 5, I spent every weekend and summer with them because my parents were always too busy. My father, Richard, worked 60-hour weeks, climbing the corporate ladder, while my mother, Diane, obsessed over her social circles. Family dinners were rare, and even then my parents were distracted by calls or planning their next party. They provided the basics but never warmth. In contrast, my grandparents filled the gap with love, stories, and lessons that would define me. Their modest 4-bedroom house and 3-acre property became my true home. Grandpa showed me how to grow tomatoes in the garden, while Grandma taught me to bake cookies and sew buttons. They came to every school play and soccer game my parents skipped. Despite their wealth, you would never know it. Grandpa drove the same pickup truck for 20 years, and Grandma clipped coupons. They always said money was just a tool, not a measure of worth. Their fortune had been built from nothing. Starting with one truck in their garage in the 1970s that grew into Alexander Logistics, a company with hundreds of trucks and multiple warehouses. They lived simply, not because they had to, but because they believed integrity and purpose mattered more. This philosophy created a rift with my father. As their only son, he expected to inherit everything and live lavishly. He resented their frugality, calling them stingy. They paid for his education, but insisted he work summer jobs, helped him with a modest house, but refused to buy him the luxury condo he wanted, and most painfully for him, declined to hand him a senior position in their company. He stormed off to chase a corporate career, and their relationship never recovered. With me, they took a different approach. They paid for my education, so I graduated debt-free. And though they could have funded any career, they encouraged me to choose passion over profit. When I became a teacher, they celebrated me, proud of my choice, even though it barely paid enough to scrape by. I lived close enough to join them for Sunday dinners every week, helping them set up new smartphones, learning their recipes, or listening to stories about their youth. They gifted me practical things: a set of tires, a good blender, but mostly they gave me time and affection. This closeness frustrated my mother, who saw my loyalty as rejection. Still, I never missed a holiday with them. That was why, when the police called one Tuesday evening to tell me my grandparents had been hit by a drunk driver, my world collapsed. They died instantly, the officer said. They did not suffer, but that truth felt hollow. At the funeral, my parents argued with the director about costs. My brother Jason barely looked up from his phone. Aunt Pam wept dramatically until the cameras stopped, and Uncle Steve faded into the background. None of them had visited in years, yet suddenly they performed grief while I stood numb, unable to accept I had lost the only people who truly saw me. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Matthew Goldstein, my grandparents' longtime attorney. He asked me and my immediate family to attend the reading of the will. On the drizzly morning, I arrived early, clutching the umbrella Grandma had insisted I always keep in my car. The office, a Victorian house downtown, smelled of wood polish. Matthew greeted me gently, recalling chess games with Grandpa and lemon bars from Grandma. His emotion nearly undid me, but before we could speak further, my parents and relatives swept in, my father leading with impatience, my mother trailing her designer handbag, Jason wearing sunglasses indoors, and Aunt Pam loud on her phone with Uncle Steve trailing silently behind. My father wasted no time declaring, "Let's get this over with." We settled around the oak table, tension pressing like a storm. Matthew explained that Elizabeth and Harold had been of sound mind when they updated their will. My father interrupted with a smirk, convinced it would name him the sole heir. But as Matthew read, the room froze. My grandparents had left everything to me, their cash assets, their $12 million investment portfolio, their $5 million home, and their $1 million stake in the company, all to their granddaughter, Natalie, and they intentionally excluded their son Richard, his wife Diane, their grandson Jason, their daughter Pam, and her husband Steve. The room erupted. My father leapt up, snatching the will, shouting it was ridiculous. My mother sneered that I could not manage such money. Jason slammed the table, demanding capital for his business. Aunt Pam accused me of manipulation. I sat stunned, barely breathing. $26 million. Entrusted to me, Matthew calmly retrieved the will and announced there was more a video message. The screen lit up with my grandparents sitting on their sofa. Grandpa spoke if we were seeing this. They were gone, but they wanted their reasoning understood. Grandma's voice followed, steady but firm, explaining how my father and aunt had prioritized material wealth, missed family events, and treated them as resources rather than loved ones. They spoke of my visits filled with care and no requests for money, of my choice to teach children for passion, not profit. They trusted me to honor their legacy. When the video ended, my father exploded, vowing to contest. Matthew reminded him their competence had been certified by multiple doctors, and that contesting would be costly and unlikely to succeed. My mother turned sweet, urging me to share. Jason scoffed. My father demanded authority, and the room boiled with pressure, overwhelmed. I stammered that I needed time. Matthew placed an envelope in my hands, filled with documents, keys, and contacts, as threats and shouting swirled. I clutched it tightly, realizing that a blessing had already turned into a curse. I left the office shaken, sat in my old sedan with the envelope on my lap, and tried to breathe through the roar in my ears. By late afternoon, I drove in circles until the sky dimmed, then turned toward my parents' house because my father had demanded a family discussion. The driveway glittered with expensive cars, the kind chosen to announce importance rather than welcome anyone. Inside the formal living room, everyone had already arranged themselves as if on a stage. My father by the fireplace with a glass in his hand, my mother perched on a stiff chair, my brother sprawled across a sofa with his phone, my aunt pacing, my uncle lingering near a window as if looking for escape. The performance began instantly. My father declared that the inheritance belonged to the family and would be better managed by him. My mother praised his experience and suggested I would be comfortable with a small portion. My brother pitched the first of many schemes that required millions of dollars. My aunt staked a claim on the house in the name of better schools for her children. My uncle whispered that everyone should calm down, but immediately fell silent when my father glared. Their strategy swerved from entitlement to guilt to intimidation, insisting that I sign a transfer authorizing my father to control everything, while promising I would receive a fraction later. When I quietly set the pen down and refused, the room hardened. What followed did not resemble family. It resembled a boardroom coup. They spoke of leverage, of lawsuits, of tactics to pressure a reluctant shareholder. My mother rehearsed a litany of supposed sacrifices from years past and attached price tags to memories that should never have been measured. My father flatly warned that if I did not sign, they would contest the will and dredge up every private moment I had shared with my grandparents, as though tenderness could be weaponized. My brother typed furiously, producing a crude document that handed over rights to all assets while giving me a percentage to be determined solely by my father. I read every line, counted the ways it erased my grandparents' wishes, pictured their careful hands signing the will that named me steward rather than ornament, and felt a steadiness gather in my chest. I declined, without drama or apology. The mask tore. My father set down his glass with so much force that it cracked, and he announced that belonging to the family depended on surrender. He drew a line that had likely existed for years, only now spoken aloud. I understood that the invitation had never been to love or kinship. It had been to obedience when I held my ground. They changed the locks in their hearts and then threatened to change the literal locks on my life. My father reminded me that the apartment lease I had proudly maintained existed under a building his investment company owned, and that I would no longer be welcome there. My mother checked a watch and allotted me 30 minutes to gather essentials before the door would be closed to me and everything left behind would be cleared out. My brother stood in the hallway like a smirking sentry while I moved through the room that had held my childhood relics. I packed clothing, toiletries, documents, and a few fragile pieces of history that still felt like mine, including my grandmother's quilt, a fabric map of safety stitched in patient squares. As I filled the last bag, they attempted a final round of cruelty disguised as honesty. They recast me as an obligation that had delayed their plans, tallied the cost of orthodontics and summer camps as if love had been a bad investment, and predicted I would quickly burn through wealth and beg to return. I did not cry in front of them. I walked past the lineup in the foyer, out into the cool night, and let the door close behind me with a sound that felt like a seal placed on a vault. In the driveway under the street lamp, the weight finally broke loose. Tears came in heavy waves. Grief for my grandparents and for the family I had imagined might still be recovered if everyone simply remembered who raised us. When the shaking slowed, I switched on the car and realized I had nowhere to go that would not require explaining everything at nearly midnight. Then I noticed the envelope on the passenger seat and remembered the keys on the rabbit-shaped keychain my grandmother had loved. The drive to their house took about 20 minutes. The porch light glowed on a timer my grandfather had set, gentle proof of his habit of planning for darkness. Inside, the scent of lemon verbena potpourri and wood polish folded around me like a memory. I turned on lights that felt too bright and made my way to the guest room I had used since I was a teenager. On the nightstand, I found the novel I had been reading a month earlier, my bookmark still waiting. Fresh towels lay folded on the dresser, the last small hospitality my grandmother had prepared without knowing she would never welcome me again. That tenderness undid me more than the threats had. I lay down fully dressed and slept as if grief had turned to stone and pinned me to the bed. Morning arrived with a brightness that felt intrusive. For one suspended second, I waited for the sound of my grandfather's off-key whistling and the clatter of a kettle. Then silence returned, and the loss came with it. My phone was crowded with missed calls and messages that swung between cajoling and menacing. A final message from my brother carried a promise that felt less like bluster and more like a warning. I forwarded it to Matthew, and within minutes he replied that he would come immediately and that I should not open the door to anyone else. He arrived with coffee and the calm of someone who has already seen the shape of a storm and mapped exits for the people inside. He listened as I described the previous night, nodded at the predictability of leverage masquerading as family, and placed a stack of documents on the table that proved my grandparents had prepared even for this. He showed me the deed to a small cottage outside town, held in a separate trust established by my grandmother. A quiet contingency against forced compliance. Relief did not erase fear, but it offered a place to stand while the floor shifted. Then another strand of their planning surfaced. The estate manager and handyman, a loyal friend who had lived in the guest house for years and had always been a kind presence at the edges of holidays, knocked at the back door and offered help. He had maintained the property meticulously and, more importantly, had updated the security system the previous year at my grandfather's request, replacing the network my father had installed with one that closed the blind spots. He had footage of family members entering after the funeral and leaving with items that did not belong to them. My grandmother's journals emerged from a study shelf, like a chorus of witnesses. In her fine script, she had recorded visits, requests, refusals, the tone of voices, the details of coffee. Left unfinished on angry afternoons, and the quiet gratitude for simple Sundays with me, where no transaction was expected. It became clear that love had been the ledger my grandparents kept most carefully, and that they had written its balance line by line. By the time Dorothy, their longtime housekeeper, arrived with her familiar cardigan and steady presence, the house no longer felt like a mausoleum, but like a gathering place of protectors. She embraced me and said I looked like Elizabeth when she was young, and in her eyes I caught a reflection of the family my grandparents had chosen. Soon others followed Rosa, their trusted business partner who knew every figure and practice of Alexander Logistics, George, the financial advisor who carried neatly ordered portfolios, Sarah, the neighbor who had shared block parties and casserole dishes for decades. Each person stepped into the living room with affection and loyalty that felt more like kinship than any claim of blood. The kitchen filled with the sound of coffee cups and voices retelling memories. Not because they wanted anything, but because they wanted me to know I was not alone. As we sorted through the journals, Dorothy uncovered a hidden compartment with letters from my father spanning years, each demanding money under shifting pretexts. Some carried veiled threats about restricting access to me. Others justified greed as necessity. The pile of requests showed a man who had mistaken entitlement for relationship. Beside them was a small USB drive containing footage of my mother collecting jewelry on the day of the funeral, choosing trinkets while condolences were still being exchanged. My grandparents had kept records not to shame but to protect. Knowing that the day might come when proof would be necessary, their careful habits now formed a shield around me. The quiet afternoon dissolved when a new text arrived from Jason. Blunt and aggressive, he wrote that the family would arrive at 10 a.m. the next morning to collect what rightfully belonged to them, and warned that things would get ugly if I tried to stop them. I showed it to Matthew, whose expression hardened into determination. He began making phone calls, his voice clipped and professional. He told me my grandparents had anticipated exactly this scenario, had outlined steps for him to follow, and that tomorrow we would be ready. That night, I sat surrounded by journals and financial documents, reading my grandmother's words about values, my grandfather's notes about integrity, and feeling a strange calm. For the first time since the will had been read, I understood that the fight was not only about money, but about honoring what they had spent their lives building. At 9:30 a.m. the next morning, the house filled again. Dorothy fried bacon and brewed coffee as if fortifying us with normalcy. Rosa set up her laptop at the dining table, ready to present evidence. Carlos stood by the door like a sentinel. Matthew reviewed restraining orders and cease and desist letters he had prepared overnight, each document a quiet weapon against threats. One by one, the allies my grandparents had cultivated arrived until the house felt less like a residence and more like a courtroom in waiting. At 9:45 a.m., the first luxury sedan pulled into the drive, followed by my mother's SUV, Aunt Pam's red convertible, and Jason's sports car. They clustered on the porch, pounding on the door. When Carlos opened it, their confident faces faltered at the sight of unfamiliar authority. They entered and froze at the gathering assembled in the living room. My father demanded to know what this was. My mother snapped about outsiders intruding on family matters, and Jason muttered about intimidation tactics. Before I could respond, 3 more figures arrived. Judge Henderson, a longtime friend of my grandparents, Police Chief Williams, who owed her daughter's education to their quiet generosity, and Thomas, the financial advisor of 2 decades. My father's attempt at charm cracked instantly when he realized the weight of the witnesses before him. The judge announced that he was there at Harold and Elizabeth's request to act as an impartial observer. The police chief stated plainly that while she was present as a friend, any crime committed would immediately become her jurisdiction. The message was clear: boundaries would be enforced. My father insisted that they had been manipulated, that the will was an injustice. One by one, The people around me countered. Thomas laid out documentation of past attempts to siphon funds, including a forged check and efforts to declare my grandmother incompetent. Rosa presented records of loans never repaid. The judge confirmed he had reviewed my grandmother's video journals, in which she articulated her decisions with clarity. My aunt erupted with accusations of betrayal, but the evidence drowned her out. Even Uncle Steve, usually silent, whispered that they should leave, though his wife shook him off. My father leafed through the envelope Matthew handed him, filled with transcripts of emails and financial transfers, and his silence grew heavy. I stepped forward then, steadied by the people behind me. I reminded my family that my grandparents' decision had not been about favoritism, but about values, about trust earned through years of consistency. I handed Jason a cease and desist order regarding his threats, gave my father a notice demanding the return of items taken from the house, and presented my mother with the conditions under which I was willing to maintain any relationship respect for my grandparents' wishes and an end to harassment. The air seemed to thin as the weight of inevitability pressed in. Chief Williams reminded them of the surveillance cameras. Carlos confirmed the recordings were stored securely off-site, and the judge concluded that no court would overturn such meticulously documented wishes. They retreated in stages. My aunt still seethed. Jason muttered threats under his breath. My mother tried to cloak defeat with disdain, and my father delivered one last hollow declaration that this was not over. Yet as their cars rolled down the driveway, the storm they had promised had already collapsed. Dorothy returned with a fresh pot of coffee. Rosa squeezed my shoulder. Matthew nodded with quiet approval, and I felt the echo of my grandparents' presence in the way these people stood with me. The family I had lost by blood had been replaced with a circle chosen through loyalty and shared respect, and for the first time since the funeral, I believed I might endure. The days that followed passed in a blur of paperwork, quiet meals, and a strange sense of relief mixed with grief. My parents and brother did not return to the house, but their calls and messages continued. Some were overt threats about lawsuits, others sugar-coated pleas about unity, and a few were manipulative attempts to paint me as cold-hearted for refusing to share. Each time, I forwarded them to Matthew, who responded with steady precision, reminding me that silence was sometimes the strongest answer. My grandmother's journals became my compass in those days. I read about small kindnesses I had long forgotten. Me bringing soup when they were ill, them laughing when I taught them to use emojis, and contrasted those tender entries with the stark records of my father's demands and my brother's schemes. It was impossible not to see the patterns they had recognized long before I had. 6 months slipped by in that rhythm. The estate's transfer was finalized, and I began to understand the true scale of what I had inherited. With Rosa's patient guidance, I learned about the logistics company and how my grandparents had always put people above profit, creating retirement plans and profit sharing long before it was common. I did not take over daily management, but I ensured the company stayed true to its founding principles. George walked me through investments, teaching me to read not just balance sheets, but intentions where money was going, what it supported, what it could build. I realized that wealth was not a pile to hoard, but a current to direct. Yet I refused to let money change everything. I returned to my kindergarten classroom at Sunshine Elementary, to the bright faces that had always grounded me. My salary no longer mattered, but my work did. I quietly funded books, technology, healthy snacks, and winter coats for students who needed them. Watching a child light up when they had what they needed to learn reminded me that small changes could ripple further than grand gestures. The foundation I established in my grandparents' names became another ripple. With $10 million dedicated to scholarships and school programs, I watched doors open for young people who had once been closed out by poverty. At the first ceremony, when 20 high school seniors accepted full scholarships, I felt my grandparents standing beside me in spirit. Meanwhile, my parents, brother, and aunt made occasional attempts to reinsert themselves. My father called when his company hit a financial wall. Speaking of temporary loans and handsome returns, my mother reached out when she realized my foundation had caught attention in her social circles, suddenly eager to serve on the board. Jason asked for capital after his latest failed scheme, and Aunt Pam suggested family holidays at my new house. Each request came dressed in familiarity, but revealed its motive quickly. I responded politely but firmly, repeating the terms set months earlier: respect my grandparents' wishes and cease using me as a bank. None of them could accept that. Their silence afterward confirmed what I already knew: the relationship they wanted was with the money, not with me. Instead, I poured my time into the community my grandparents had built. Sunday dinners continued in their kitchen, the table filled with friends and associates who had known them best. Dorothy still came 3 times a week, insisting she could not retire while the house still needed her touch. Carlos cared for the grounds, his quiet loyalty a constant reminder of trust well placed. Rosa guided me patiently through complex decisions. Matthew remained a steady legal anchor, and Sarah dropped by with casseroles and neighborhood news. It was not the family I was born into, but it was the one my grandparents had quietly chosen and left for me. One crisp autumn morning, nearly identical to the day of the accident, I finally visited their graves. I had avoided it for months, afraid the grief would split open again, but I carried fresh flowers and sat on the small bench nearby, speaking aloud as if they could hear. I told them about the scholarships, the foundation, the company that still thrived under their principles. I admitted how heavy the responsibility felt, but also how honored I was to carry it. A breeze stirred the golden leaves around me, and I chose to take it as an answer, a reminder that love endures beyond absence. As the months deepened, I uncovered more of their quiet generosity. Hidden in records and letters were countless examples of anonymous gifts. They had made medical bills paid for families in need, mortgages quietly saved from foreclosure, employees' children sent to college. They had never sought recognition, only impact. Understanding this clarified everything. Their decision to entrust the estate to me had never been about favoritism. It had been about passing on a philosophy, ensuring that their wealth continued to function as a tool for good. When the foundation hosted its first large-scale event, awarding scholarships to underprivileged students, One young woman reminded me of myself years ago. Her parents worked multiple jobs, and no one in her family had ever gone to college. She wept as she accepted the scholarship, saying it would change everything not only for her, but for her younger siblings who now believed college was possible. In her gratitude, I saw the full circle of my grandparents' legacy. I understood then that the inheritance had indeed revealed true colors. It had shown me the greed of relatives who valued money over relationship. But it had also illuminated a community of genuine care. The wealth was a blessing, but the true inheritance was a vision of what love and values could create. And it was my duty and my privilege to carry it forward. If you have ever faced pressure from family or loved ones when money or inheritance was involved, you know how painful it can be to stand alone. But remember, standing firm in your values reveals not only who is against you, but also who truly stands with you. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment with your own experience. Let's build a community that values integrity over greed and love over advantage.